Human lives have been shaped by fire for as long as we've walked the earth. Can you think of a folktale or a story or a myth that includes fire? Does your family or culture have any traditions that involve fire, flames, or candles? Unlike in Western culture today, ancient humans probably wouldn't have seen wildfire as an exclusively destructive phenomenon, but may have appreciated its constructive impact and its usefulness for developing human technologies and practices. Early hominids probably relied on fire so that they could collect burning coals and sticks to cook their food and clear land. The protection and warmth of sitting around a fire helped build community bonds and may have even helped establish language. Fire has become a central object to the social and spiritual life of humans in a way that endures into the present. Indigenous communities all over the world have used the regenerative power of controlled fire on hunting and food gathering grounds for centuries. Called thus not just because of its spiritual and communal significance to native tribes, but cultural burnings also cultivate a diverse culture of plant life that makes ecosystems more resilient and sustainable. Burning practices are often passed down from generation to generation, specifically addressing the regeneration and cultivation of game or plant species and even waterways. The goal of cultural burning is to facilitate the natural reproductive cycles of specific ecosystems. Native communities' cultural burning practices reduce fuels and keep more dangerous wildfires at bay by slowly burning the extra fuel on the forest floor while still keeping the blaze contained. They also cultivate fertile forests and grasslands to feed their communities. My guest today has worked closely with Native communities and archaeologists in the Southwest and in the northern Great Plains to, quote, apply earth science methods and techniques to the reconstruction of spatial patterns of human behavior in ritual and domestic contexts. Basically, a field of study referred to as human pyrogeography.
Chris Rose. I am a professor of anthropology at Southern Methodist University. So I took a hiatus in graduate school after my master's degree just to work because I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And while I was working on a project in Hawaii, I was getting emails from my university, which is the University of Arizona, about the evacuation of my friends and some of my professors from what at the time became Arizona's largest recorded wildfire, the Rodeo Chediskai fire. And the fire burned through their camp, destroyed some historically significant pieces of equipment that had been in use by the Arizona Field School for almost a century. And it really struck me as odd that this field school, the Arizona Field School in the mountains of eastern Arizona, have been going on for almost 100 years because there's so much archaeology up there. Um, and nobody that I had seen had talked about at all the fact that these were fire prone forests that people were living in. And on the flip side, the people who were studying fire in these forests seemed to be totally oblivious to this rich archaeology that showed that there were lots of people living up there for a long period of time. And I thought that it was an aha moment for me that someone needed to do this. Someone needed to bring these two together to understand how people lived in these fire prone places, and whether they used fire to help manage risk or to improve resources, what that looked like, and importantly, what that might say to us as we wrestle with the best ways to manage fire in these places.
Absolutely. So have approaches and attitudes towards fire changed since you have begun in the field?
Yeah, I'd say so. So that same year, 2002, there was a book published edited by Thomas Vail, who's a biogeographer, where almost every single one of the chapters in the book was formulaic in its rejection of historical evidence for Native American burning and an argument that uh, you don't need to have Native American as ignition sources in order to have the fires that you saw historically, either from charcoal records or from tree rings. And the argument was essentially you don't need to invoke Native American burning or fire management to explain what we see. Therefore, they didn't do this at all. And that became an important foil for me in a lot of my own research. And we're in a completely different place now. There's still some people who make some version of that same argument, but they're in the minority. Some of my close collaborators were maybe not in exactly that camp, but were very skeptical about the potential importance of Native American burning in forests that we knew would burn a lot anyway. Um, and they've really come around. Right? They've really they've been research partners of mine, and the work that we've done together, they're fully committed to very clear evidence for Native American fire management, that it has some significant consequences, and that it can, in many cases, actually support some of the ideals of contemporary fire management involving forest restoration, restoration of fires and ecological process, thinning and creating defensible spaces around homes and so forth.
Yeah, and definitely a lot of our new policies are not very new ideas in regards to our relationship with fire as a species. But would you describe a moment of wonder that you had in your research that stuck with you? I know that you've worked on the Great Plains and you've worked in New Mexico and you've worked outside of the US as well. But what's a moment of wonder that you've had that has really impacted you?
Well, I think something that really struck me just in the last few months, did a paper that's a big regional tree ring synthesis, where we looked at it across scales, but we drilled into three different cultural landscapes: so a Navajo cultural landscape, a Jemez cultural landscape, and an Apache cultural landscape. And my expectations going into it were that these were very different culturally and economically. So Amos folks were farmers. Navajo folks were largely pastoralists. Apaches were largely foragers. And I thought that we'd see something different. So our focus was on fire climate relationships and how native fire management influenced those fire climate relationships. It ended up being that we, at every one of those, we saw exactly the same thing and exactly the same pattern as you scale up from local influences to landscape influences, and that blew me away. I did not expect that, and it really highlighted something that you actually see, globally in the ethnography of fire use, which is that most of the fire, not all of the fire, but most of the fire is done in things that we would call particularly small patches, less than 100 hectares, largely, and that kind of patchwork of lots and lots of small fires is what was disconnecting the fire climate relationships. And it didn't matter if it was done for pasture management or if it was done for farming or if it was done for hunting. It had the same consequence on fire climate relationships across those three culture areas. That was very eye opening for me.
Yeah, and you mentioned looking at the rings of trees to determine, some of the burn patterns. If I were to look at the core of a tree, what would I be seeing that would tell me that there was a fire versus just a regular growth season?
Yeah. So what happens when a fire burns around the base of a tree? If it's got really thick bark, a lot of times it won't be affected at all. Um, but sometimes, especially at particular life stages of the tree where the bark is not quite thick enough yet, or if, say, the fire is moving uphill, so it eddies on the upslope side, it gets a little more hot there, and it kills the tissue that grows the tree. Right, the trees grow from the outside in, and so the living tissue is actually right there underneath the bark. And if that dies, the bark will just drop off, and the tree will try to heal from the sides. Kind of like if you cut your hand, right? The skin will try to grow from the sides to heal across the middle. So the tree tries to do that. And so if you have a cross section of a tree that's experienced fires like this, you can see where the damage happened, and importantly, where the tree tried to grow back over it. And that is what allows you to date it, not just to the year. You can actually tell, what part of the growing season, depending on, how much of the ring had been put on before it died in that local part of the tree and started healing back over it. So you can narrow it down to the month even, um, if the scar is clear enough.
That's really cool. I feel like that transitions well into talking about the ways that humans have relationships with fire, the same way that all species in fire affected environments do. So, based on our best estimates right now, where and when does humans' relationship with fire begin?
So I am pretty thoroughly convinced by an argument called the pyrophilic primate hypothesis, which focuses on our relationship to fire, not say through starting fires, but the evolution of our ancestors in the most flammable biome on the planet, and that's tropical grasslands and savannas. Those burn all the time. In some cases, actually twice a year they'll burn. And so our first relationship with fire goes really, really deep because there are arguments to be made about earliest bipedal versions, the very first hominins, um, evolving to take advantage of savanna ecosystems. In which case, they absolutely would have been around fire all the time if they were out and foraging in these savanna ecosystems. And the pyrophilic primate hypothesis suggested that first kind of recursive relationship maybe started 2.5 million years ago when our ancestors learned to do something that some modern bird species do. There are birds in Australia, brown falcons and black kites, that hunt for insects and small vertebrates at the front of savanna fires. And they are known to, if it gets really congested, say there are a lot of birds hunting at the edge of the fire, to swoop down, grab a firebrand, and start a new fire front, and so that they can hunt along that one, right?
Yeah.
And the pyrophilic primate hypothesis is basically just that our ancestors learning to benefit from post-fire environments for foraging would also have helped to expand fire fronts to increase their access to the benefits of post-fire environments
Yeah.
on those savannas. And so, long before we could start fires, we were basically influencing the frequency of fires in those savannas, um, creating, inadvertently cooked foods like tubers that have been turned up by, rooting animals that get cooked in the fire front. Small vertebrates, lizards and mammals cooked in the fire front that are available as cooked food. Because certainly by 2 million years ago, right, there's very clear evidence anatomically that our ancestors were eating a fair bit of cooked food, but there's almost no archaeological evidence that they were cooking over a fireplace the way that we think of it. And so there's almost certainly happening on the landscape.
Yeah. And I could, oh gosh, how I want to get into all of the ways that fire has, changed our physiology and our evolution as a species. But I really want to dig into your research that involves pyrogeography and the human fire climate nexus. Can you just describe what these two fields of study entail and how they're connected to each other?
Yes, so pyrogeography is still kind of an emerging transdisciplinary field of kind of holistic fire science, the study of fire on Earth and kind of all places and times. And it's meant to be kind of an umbrella discipline, the way that geography or anthropology are pretty big umbrella disciplines. But in this case, capturing a lot of fire science work that cuts across disciplinary boundaries. And so I think of myself as a human pyrogeographer, or sometimes as an archaeological pyrogeographer, because my research questions are really driven by those that are tied into pyrogeography more than maybe classical anthropological ones. Um, and the Fire Climate Society Nexus is a really important reference point for me in my work because I don't think we can understand any part of that relationship without the other one. That for as long as we've had people in fire-prone places, um, you can't exclude them, and you can't exclude climate as an important driver of fuels and ignitions too. So you kind of have to look at them in tandem. So a lot of the work that I've done in the Southwest has not just been to look at, say, evidence for indigenous fire management, but to look at how indigenous fire management influence fire climate relationships. So this paper that I mentioned earlier that came out in December, it wasn't just to identify people, because in some or in fire sorry in forests that burn a lot anyway, just looking at, say, the frequency of fire can make it really hard to unambiguously distinguish human influences. um, but if you know when people are there using archaeology, ethnohistory, and can subdivide time in a way to look at, kind of before and after, or with people and with lighter influences. You can see that there are very clear impacts on the way that fire and climate interact because of the moderating influences of people. Working on a project now in well, I'm writing up a project that I did a while ago in Fiji, where we're looking at the same thing. There, the prevailing view had been that, right, after um, um, first human settlers show up using fire for swidden or slash and burn agriculture, they deforested these landscapes very quickly, and it was just entirely people. And it's more complicated than that because those same settings were already vulnerable to climate largely through El Nino. And there's evidence for pre-human fires and deforestation associated with El Nino droughts. And much of the activity after people show up, even though there's definitely a lot more fire and people are definitely using fire, but the big pulses of deforestation and fire activity are actually associated with El Nino droughts. And so it's just kind of impossible to say that it's all people or it's all climate, because it's all three of those things: fire, climate, people working together that are creating the reality that we inherit and that we experience.
Absolutely. And so, with that background knowledge, set the scene for us. What are the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico like, and who has lived there in this area historically?
Yeah, so the Jemez Mountains, I'm biased by the way. The Jemez Mountains are one of the most beautiful places on earth. Um, it is kind of volcanic deposits, uplifted sedimentary rocks, and an ancient supervolcano that's not extinct. It's just dormant at the moment. Um, so there's a big caldera. It's not as big as the Yellowstone caldera, but there's a big caldera there. It's about 40 kilometers across. And within that are big, beautiful grassy valleys. And the rest of it is kind of covered with ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests. And on the southwestern side of those mountains, where several of the major drainages go through, the Jemez River, the Guadalupe River, are these forested mesas where the ancestors of the people from the modern Pueblo of Jemez lived. And there's evidence that Native American folks have been using these environments for at least 12,500 years. But it's about 900 years ago when oral traditions and archaeology indicate that the ancestors of Jemez folks migrated from the north, probably somewhere in the San Juan Basin, looking for the eagle dwelling place. And on the largest peak, the resurgent dome in the caldera, there was a meadow that actually took on the shape of an eagle in profile. And this was one of the symbols that let Jemez people know that this is where they were supposed to settle, where the creator wanted them to settle. And so they began settling this in the 1100s. And then there was another bigger migration in the 1300s that expanded the population there to about 8,000 people. And so if the federal government was around then, this would have been classified as something that we call the wildland urban interface today, with a population
Mm.
density of about 17 people per square kilometer. And so this would have been, it's kind of the highest density category of wildland urban interface. And that makes it a really interesting situation for us, kind of as a historical example for relatively high density populations living in these fire prone settings, to see how they lived there, how they persisted, and they lived on these forested mesas until the 17th century, when the Spanish policy of congregación forced them off of the mesas and down into the river valley. And from there, the depredations of colonialism and violence it led to about 87% population loss, and basically it really diminished the indigenous fire management when you went from 8,000 people to 900 people. Um, it was a big change. And then for the next couple centuries, it was largely not managed. It was mostly driven by lightning, fire regimes. Grazing mattered a little bit in some places and sometimes, but it became riskier to be up there because of raids from more mobile groups, including the Navajo.
Yeah, and I had the chance to go to Valles Caldera and Bandelier this summer. And just for other people listening who aren't familiar with the area, going to somewhere like Bandelier, you sort of start to realize that some of these dwellings were just like apartment buildings, like in cities. Like there
Yeah.
were a ton of people living in these areas, stacked on top of each other and in multiple different like dwellings, like right next to each other, the same way that we live today. So I definitely feel like that's a misconception that I want people to imagine as they're hearing you describe that too. And I also
Yes.
agree the caldera is like the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. But yeah. So what kind of evidence or sorry. Yeah, so what kind of evidence have archaeologists uncovered in the ancestral Puebloan territory, and what does it tell us about their particular relationship to fire?
Yes. Yeah. So one thing that was a really interesting outcome of our work there, we had gone to many of the large pueblos, and as you were saying, some of these housed 1,000 to 1,500 people at their peak, and in kind of apartment style agglomerated um, dwellings. And we wanted to try to pinpoint the date at which they were no longer being occupied. And so we went looking for old standing trees, old dead trees on top of these pueblos. But we also went up to a couple hundred meters around them. And yeah, at none of these that we looked at were there any living trees on or within a couple football fields of these small towns, which is pretty remarkable. There were no living trees while people were living there. Um, and if you think of a couple thousand feet trampling around those pueblos every day, the fuels around these pueblos would have been very, very different than it is today. But it would look a lot like what the National Fire Safety Program called FireWise advocates for, where you create defensible space around your homes. So you remove, flammable fuels and heavy fuels from near your homes. The trees were gone. The fine fuels are probably gone. They suggest that you thin the trees, in the next zone around your home, and that the strength of that thinning could get weaker the further you go, but it basically would force any fire down to the surface before it got to your house, and therefore it could be defensible. Well, this is what these were like, because the smaller diameter trees closest to the pueblo would have been harvested for fuel wood and um, for construction. So this basically these communities were fire wise communities, and there's definitely evidence for fires burning around them, because you get further away than 200 meters, and you find the evidence of the trees that were alive while people were there, and many of those have fire scars on them. So there were fires that were burning around, but they were never bothering these communities because they were really well protected.
Huh. So, how did this fire use and also these like prevention strategies for disastrous impacts of fire evolve as the practices were employed by subsequent indigenous nations?
Mm. So one of the major uses of fire for Hamish folks would have been associated with agriculture, both establishing agricultural fields and recycling nutrients. So, I mean, even today, Hamish farmers who are down in the valley, they in the spring they burn off all the stubble from their fields to recycle it as ash, and so that's something that's persisted. They probably also used fire for managing habitat for preferred game. You have to remember that there's only one domesticated animal that may have been used for food, and that's the domestic turkey. But at Jemez, we actually don't know how important the turkey was, because we don't have a lot of good archaeological evidence for that. But at other Pueblo communities, it certainly was. Um, but right when people move in the 1100s, there's a big increase in herbivores, large herbivores, probably deer and elk, that is associated with the lots of fires that people are setting as they're kind of creating the agricultural landscape. And they probably went at great distances from the pueblos to use fire to manipulate potential browse and graze for those herbivores to increase their chances of hunting in the future because they know where the good spots are, right? And that's something that was probably done by hunting and gathering groups as well. It's something you see a lot. I've just been surveying a lot of the ethno-historical literature on Native American burning, and that's kind of a very frequently used one. Is you might call it habitat improvement or pasture improvement, although you have to include browse in there too. Um, and some of the discussion involve medicinal plants, tobacco, using fire either to just kind of reset a plot for wild tobacco, but very frequently you burn areas with kind of coarser fuels, producing lots of ash, and plant tobacco in those settings. Um, those are some of the big ones, but it's certainly not exhaustive
Yeah,
of the way
absolutely.
that folks would use fire.
Yeah, and I had read a quote at one point saying that when the, Spanish conquistadors had first come through the western part of what is now the United States, they described the area as looking like a well-kept garden and then dismissed all of the very advanced strategies that the indigenous people who lived here for much longer had already figured out and been employing, for generations and generations and generations. But yeah, so describe the modern fire relationship right now, especially in the case of climate change. And we just had a really big burn in the area kind of recently. So describe the modern fire relationship in this region, both with native and non-native inhabitants.
Yeah, it's really fraught. Um, so right now we have an enormous fire deficit, starting in the late 19th century when the connection of the transcontinental railroads allowed for overstocking of these landscapes with sheep and cattle. Those basically ate the surface fuels that allowed fires to burn very frequently in most of these dry forests. Um, and that was long before Smokey Bear. That they were basically suppressing fires through overgrazing. Then we have official policies that happened in the early 20th century, and so basically these forests have uh, standing fuels that have built up over 140 years, 150 years even in some cases. That is nothing like these forests would have experienced in at least the last 1,000, 2,000, maybe 12,000 years. And that makes everything a bit more tricky, right? You can't just put fire back into those forests because they don't burn the same way anymore. That's the context where the fires would go from burning along the surface of grasses and down needles and gets into the canopy of the trees and kills all the trees. And if it kills all the trees, there's no seed for the forest to come back, right? Um, so one of the first things that um, kind of federal agencies try to do is go and thin out all the young trees and the ones that are less than 120 years old, to try to get the old structure back so they can receive fire again. But that's tricky because it's expensive. A lot of that work has to be done by hand, and there's not enough money to pay the labor to do it, and it takes a long time. And the way that fires are happening now, we're just not we're not thinning enough forest to catch up with um, climate change, right? And
Totally.
that's the other part of it. So we have this fire deficit that makes everything so much more vulnerable to fire. When it used to depend on fire, now it's really vulnerable to it. And then you've got climate change that has made for what's probably the worst drought over the last 22 years, in at least 1,200 years. And it's only likely to keep getting worse. And that makes it a lot trickier for getting fire out in the places that can receive it. So maybe the places that you thin, it's a lot harder to predict the burn conditions. And so two of the well, they became one big fire, but the two fire starts that became New Mexico's biggest fire in recorded history last summer, the Calf Canyon, Hermit's Peak fires, those were both management fires, right? One was a prescribed burn that was started in the spring when conditions historically had been at their best, easiest to control fires then, but the winds were high, it was super dry, it was really risky, and it blew up.
Mm-hmm.
The other one was a pile burn that they did in January, I think, when there was snow on the ground, but it smoldered and it kicked up again when the winds kicked up in the spring. And so it's becoming really hard with climate change to make predictions about when you actually can do the burning that you want to do. Um, and that's something that is a challenge too for indigenous fire practitioners, say in California, because a lot of the signals that they use in the environment to make decisions, right, and the very sophisticated fire knowledge, are changing with climate change, and that's making it a lot harder for everybody to deal with. Right, it's making the summer drought hotter, which makes fuels more explosive, which makes fire behavior more extreme, and it just kind of compounds on itself.
Totally. All right. Well, just to sort of wrap up today, what do you wish that more people knew about wildfire aside from all the wonderful knowledge you've already departed today?
Yeah, well, one thing I wish that more people knew is that indigenous people in the Americas and elsewhere, but especially in the Americas, had accumulated really sophisticated knowledge about the way fire works in their environments. And they developed ways to use it to their benefit and in ways that we could really learn from today. As in many circumstances, the fires weren't to reduce fire hazard in the past, but they can't do that, right? The goals were things that may be influence biodiversity, which we might also really want to be able to do, right? Or support, sensitive species, which we might also really want to do. And so I think there's a lot to learn from engaging with, the first peoples of this continent and being humble and accepting that we might not be doing things the right way and that we can learn to do things better.
Thanks for hanging in there for another long episode this week. Just a reminder that Blaze will have an interactive exhibition on May 12th next week from 12 to 2 on the second floor of the 623 Wabash building at the Manifest Urban Arts Festival. I hope to see you there. This has been Louise with the Blaze Project.